Thanks. Took like 45 seconds to get him off my stage. That's awesome.
I have one more thing. Okay.
Oh, god damn it. So, how many of you are developers? How many of you are working actively with AI projects? Like maybe 20% max. How many of you are actively using Azure AI Studio? A few. Cool. That is maybe even more than I expected, because this is sort of a, I'm not going to say hidden gem, but it's a hidden piece of Azure AI. They're pushing it in the marketing. My experience is that most people don't really understand why it is there and what can I use it for. So I'm kind of going to spend the next 50 minutes covering some parts of Azure AI Studio and explaining why you might want to use it, why it might become more relevant in the future. This session is going to be way more about ideas than actually hands-on doing something. Demoing AI things is always complicated because it's stochastic, it works differently every time, but it's also very slow. So you're going to see these things through a set of screenshots and some explanations on how I feel this is going to affect our architectural decisions over time. First, one positioning slide from Microsoft, then I'm going to leave theirs. So what Microsoft is telling us is that Azure AI is this top brand that contains Azure AI services, containing things like OpenAI service as well, but also machine learning, computer vision models like Florence, speech-to-text, universal translator, so on, document intelligence, there's a lot to go on from there. Azure machine learning, the classic ML service, and responsible AI tooling, content safety, and so on. AI Studio is intended to be the user interface to all these. So the original title for this session was this: what are they trying to do with it? And that's kind of what we're going to dig into here. So I would split Azure AI Studio's functionality into 7 different buckets. I'm going to cover some of them in more detail, some of them in less. But if you look at this, it's less about new features. It's not that model that is so different from GPT-4. It's the ability to engage with any model. It's not so much some new cool feature about universal translation or computer vision. It's more about the tooling, the way you work with those AI innovations. Let's kick this off. What is Azure AI Studio? And what the hell is Azure AI Studio Hub? Some parts of Microsoft documentation say it's an Azure AI Studio Hub. Some just say it's Azure AI Hub. Anyway, the idea, it is a free top-level Azure resource that groups your AI assets. You don't have to use it at this time. You can pick any Azure resource type. You can pick machine learning. You can pick OpenAI service, computer vision, whatever. And you can just make those resources run. AI Studio is one more way to group your projects and resources. If you start building an Azure AI Hub or creating a new one, there are a few things you may want to pay attention to. First of all, there's a Heja Sverige story here. So you essentially have to pick Sweden Central if you want to do anything meaningful at this time. I hope it's not going to be like that forever, although Sweden Central is a great data center. Oh, sorry about that. All right. The other thing you should notice here, there's this thing called Default Project Resource Group. And I'm going to talk about this a bit more in the future. But you will see that this Azure AI Hub concept, it does almost nothing by itself. It's just a user interface. What it is, it's a platform for launching other Azure resources, creating AI projects and then resources for them. And that resource group, this default project resource group, that is the place that the new projects are going to be deployed into. But it's also grouping some resources by itself. So, as you can see, when you go to the next page, you will see that you're going to attach a storage account, a Key Vault, application insights, container registry. You're starting to get the hang of it. This is a free resource that connects a set of resources you need for your AI Studio experiences. So essentially building those applications, and in some cases also hosting the apps. I'm going to explain this in a bit more detail. So that Azure AI Studio part you see so much talked about is just a user interface to this hub. What it looks like at a resource level, your per hub resources are like this. So you have that actual hub. Then you have storage accounts, key vaults, application instances, and so on. All of this is free until you use it, because all of those are pay-as-you-go resources. Then when you start creating projects, I'll shortly explain what they are, you will also come up with other resources. So you can, for example, have machine learning endpoints, or you can have serverless deployments of some models, or whatever. There are a lot of or containers. There are a lot of different kinds of resources that the AI Studio can provision for you. At the portal level, it looks exactly as boring as any modern Azure resource. There's really something else here. That button says Launch Azure AI Studio, and that's where we're going next. So, Microsoft hasn't done a great job in distincting between services and projects. Their terminology is still wavering a bit here, but I think the final version, the final one published in build of Azure AI Studio kind of makes this clear. So there's the distinction between Azure AI Services. You can see it over there on the left-hand side, Azure AI Services. That means all the Azure's as a service AI features. You go there. You see, it's pretty much like what you had before with all those Azure different kinds of services. You had Vision Studio, you had Speech Studio, and so on. All of that has now been grouped into Azure AI Studio. So one part of Azure AI Studio is that it's a unified user interface for all this, and you can go as deep as you want. If you pick up something like Vision plus Document, then you can pick up those Azure Document Intelligence usage scenarios from the left-hand pane. For example, marriage certificate. Okay, cool. It's fun that we have something for that. Anyway, this is kind of the services you've used to waiting for. So Azure AI Studio is, first of all, it's the unified admin panel for all those services. But second of all, and what we're going to focus on for the rest of the presentation, it's a DevOps environment for Gen AI projects. I don't think, Microsoft's opinion may differ, but I don't think these two realities are too well connected yet. They are connected in a sense, but I feel that when Microsoft launched Azure AI Studio, they wanted to do this part one. They wanted to have this unified admin panel, but their real focus is on building something new for the Gen AI projects. What are Gen AI projects? If you build a new Azure AI Studio or Azure AI Studio Hub or whatever, and you pick up the studio, you will find this kind of interface. Projects, new project. Okay, what is a project? Essentially what they are a collection of AI resources for a single purpose. The idea here is that the AI Studio gives you the tooling to develop and then eventually also deploy those resources into production use. Azure AI Studio story is also about collaboration. So the idea is that if you have a group of people working on an AI solution, they can come together and use Azure AI Studio as the tool to change how the LLM parts or the AI parts in that application work. Some of you are smelling portal-based editing in production here, and I see where that's coming from. There are some issues here. Also, projects. The hub also acts as a grouping in the sense that projects can share some resources within the same hub. So, for example, you can have deployments of custom models, or you can have a compute capacity for some certain model or whatever scenario, and you can have connections to external services, indexes, databases, OpenAI service instances outside the hub. So, essentially, what's happening here is just a topology of concepts. And if you create a project, it's very simple. There are no magic properties here. You're just giving essentially a name. Then you get a project view. And if you look at the left-hand pane again, there are lots of features there, and we're going to look into them. But really, it's nothing more than a container. Essentially, an Azure AI Hub is a control surface for a group of projects. We do not know what a project means. You can think of it as an application. I think that kind of makes sense. So if you are building an AI-enabled application, you might use Azure AI projects as a way to group together all the AI assets for a single application. That would make sense. From a practical standpoint, it might also make sense to have functionality for a single module of a larger application grouped as a single project. I don't think there is the right answer here. It's just like solutions and projects in Visual Studio. You can use them however you want. But you can have those shared resources and you can have those project level resources. And that's kind of the approach Microsoft is taking here. Now, the question I think some of you may be thinking about, what do we need this for? Because that is what I've been thinking about. I have 4 thoughts on the matter. First of all, as a developer, just writing code, just building the application, I don't think I need this level of control. Because I'm used to infrastructure as control, as code. So I can use Bicep or I can use whatever, Terraform, to provision my resources. Okay, well, the second problem or thought is, am I right? Because if I want to share resources between applications, that is always a bit complicated with IAC. Technically, you can do it. Admin-wise, you end up with different concerns. So it might be easier if you had a higher level abstraction on sharing those AI resources. But why do you want to share something that is essentially pay-as-you-go? Well, another question there is it always going to be pay-as-you-go in the future? Because many of you, if you have built AI applications using OpenAI service, you have already maybe encountered the truth that OpenAI service does not always perform as you would expect. You are seeing bottlenecks in performance. You are seeing you're hitting the tokens per minute gap. So maybe you want more capacity. Well, the way you use that capacity is you buy provisioned capacity, or PTUs, provision throughput units is the term right now. That is kind of the enterprise approach to using OpenAI service. If you want to go PTUs, then maybe you actually want to share one because you don't want to have a PTU per application. That's just going to be too expensive. So we've been used to having these AI services available in a pay-as-you-go fashion, but as you go to custom fine-tuned models and so on, where you actually have to pay for the capacity yourself, then you want to pool the resources. So that is something to think about. Third, Microsoft sees a particular need for LLM apps. Control, meaning security, governance, monitoring, content safety. I'm going to openly say I don't see all that much of this need. But that is also because the apps we're building are small. They're simple, and that's also point 4. Because our apps are so simple, we don't need all this control. But if you think of it, Microsoft's approach to this, they are like 5 years ahead of us in terms of scaling AI apps and thinking about responsible AI. What they are encountering now is probably something we're going to encounter in a few years. So I think this may make sense from governance perspective in the future. I'm not seeing the benefit right now. That said, this part was about governance. This part was about organization. Then we're going to go into what can we do in terms of technical features. Alternate models and hosting. How many of you have actually used a model other than GPTs? Okay, a few. How many of you have used another model in production? Nobody. Yep, that's how it is. Our AI fever is open AI fever right now. It doesn't have to be that in the future. And not only that, but it can also be a multimodal future. So we think that GPT-4 is the awesomest whatever thing ever, because we've had so much experience with it, and GPT-4o is amazing, and it feels like Sam Altman is always pushing the frontier, and we're getting the best things from them, and that has kind of been true. The problems come when you start scaling things, because you may encounter the fact that actually it is pretty expensive to use GPT-4 for everything, even though you may need more performance. You may need more scalability than you can get with GPT-4. You may need to run locally, which is something that Microsoft is now doing with the Windows Copilot Plus strategy, so that's one thing. Or you may need to fine-tune something to a special need, so you may know that your domain needs a fine-tuned model. It's going to be rare, but it can happen. So these are scenarios where you can't just pick up the whatever Azure OpenAI service is now offering, GPT-7X or whatever is the newest and greatest thing. We are going to want to think about which model to use for which task. And if you think about a product like Copilot for Microsoft 365, the product team has to think a lot about which model to use for which scenario, because they know that GPT 3.5 is going to be able to perform certain tasks just as well as 4.0. But 3.5 is going to be faster, it's going to be cheaper. And yeah, maybe 4.0, maybe 4P or 4N or whatever, it's going to catch up. But then we're going to have GPT-5, and everybody's going to expect everything to run on 5. But 5 is, again, going to be expensive and slow. So we are going to be thinking about this, the more data we are going to pass to the LLMs. So we have these tools. Let's kick it off with the model catalog, because this is something that Microsoft is demoing every now and then. If you have good eyes, you can see that there are currently 1,672 models available in the catalog. And essentially what Azure AI Studio brings to you is it enables you to just spin up any of these models and have an endpoint you can call. How's that going to happen? Pick up a model from this list. You will see that this is Phi3, small, 8K instruct. Those names are horrible, but what it means is we have 8,000 tokens. And if you read the text, you will notice that we have 7 billion parameters. And now you can feel very wise when you know that. I have no idea what it actually means in practice, but that's what happens. What is good about this is that there is this box that says intended uses, primary use cases and use case considerations. These kind of give you an idea on what kind of material the model has been trained and tested on. So you should have a rough understanding of, is it reasonable to try to use Phi3 for my Finnish translation or Savo poem application or whatever. You can also test them. You can see there's a box where you can just type anything and the model will respond to you. So Microsoft is hosting copies of at least some of these models so that you can test them. Now, when you go to deployment, what actually happens is that you will just create a deployment. Okay, that's not very well visible on this screen. So there you can see you can pick a VM size, and for this Phi3 model, the smallest size you can pick is a VM that costs about $5 an hour. So that is not super cheap, and now we come back to pooling resources. So this is something you need to consider. Some of those models require significant investment to run. Also, one thing you need to notice, if you want to go to production fast, you will need to apply to have production quota. So Microsoft support will give you a production quota when you ask for it, but out of the box you will only be able to provision endpoints for a week for some models. These are things you need to consider, but you will want to test first, not go to production directly. Once you're done, you will get a host name, and then Azure ML will host the endpoint for you. So you will just find standard instructions for that in Microsoft Learn, so no any special things up there. About these endpoints, you can see when we provision one, it just has URLs, it has primary keys and so on. So this is a very standard Azure resource. You really want to start with playing this on the playground. So if you have used Azure OpenAI Studio, you know there is an Azure OpenAI Studio playground. There's also an Azure AI Studio playground without the open part, but it's still open. So if you use this playground, you can chat with the model, just as you did in the previous screen, but now it is your own model. And as you can see, on the right-hand side, there is a deployment choice. In Azure OpenAI Studio, you classically had that deployment drop-down, only contained those OpenAI models you had deployed. With Azure AI Studio, there can be any model in it. Now, if you try something like, let's say, summarize the following text without marketing hype, and then I paste it in a piece of documentation on Azure AI Studio from Microsoft Learn, then you get some kind of summary. And in this scenario, I found out that actually Phi3 summarizes quite nicely. So this fast, like 2-minute test, has proven to me that I can actually use Phi3 for my scenario if I want. Is it going to be cheaper at $5 an hour? Maybe, if I use enough of it. So these are kind of the things I'm going to have to think about. Also, what I'm going to have to think about is that these small models, they often have their issues. And we're going to come down to AI testing and these things a bit later on in the presentation. When I tried to do the previous test, this one, I actually failed because I didn't remember that I can't have a line feed in the input box. So I only submitted this. Summarize the following text, remove all marketing hype. What was the response I got? The text provides information on product design to improve sleep quality. Where did that come from? Then it goes on to describe lines and lines of some kind of a mask that goes on your face. And it helps me achieve deeper sleep by providing a cool and dark environment. So that's a hallucination happening right over there in a very simple prompt. I don't get this on GPT-4o. I don't get this on many of the bigger models. So you have to test if you want to use different models.
But it's correct that the battery life is not specified in the text.
Yes, it is absolutely correct that the battery life is not specified in the text. Thank you, Saki, for your contribution.
No worries. I'm here.
We are so happy about that. Okay, so there's absolutely no substitute for testing yourself, but if you want to look at what kind of models are available, there's also this very cool and actually very useful feature called model benchmarks, where you can go and see different kinds of models arranged according to test results on categories you choose. So you can see like maybe the top 3 models, the top 5 models you want to go deeper into testing yourself because you can't test 1,600 models. Now the question probably many of you thought about was, do I really have to pay $5 an hour for virtual machines? That seems so last year. You don't, for some parts. So you can also filter the model catalog by choosing Serverless API. You will see that if you choose Serverless API, you will only have 30 models. But for those models, you will be able to go much faster and much easier. So for example, I'm going to pick up here Llama 3, the 70 billion parameter version. And now on the deploy page, I don't have to choose a VM, but I'm just going to see that the inference is going to cost me like $1 cent per 1,000 tokens and so on. Very much more like Azure OpenAI service. Now when I deploy model, I just get an endpoint into the public version of Llama 3. I can't customize it, obviously. It's just the way it is with Azure OpenAI service. But this is the way to get some services available for you cheaper without a fixed cost investment. And now I can try something like, let me talk Finnish to that one. So osaatko puhua suomea, and it will give me a reasonable answer. So with Llama 3, I can use Finnish. I can't always do that with Phi 3. It depends. Now, can also connect other resources. For example, if I connect GPT-4, I can have that as well. One thing to realize here is that if you look at this chat session, I still have Llama 3 selected. I only have an input box. Start typing here, nothing else. If I pick up GPT-4, then this is going to look like Azure OpenAI service in the sense that I have these all features familiar from there. So I can adjust the model parameters, temperature and so on. I can also use this add your data, and I can also enter a system message. So this playground experience differs per model, although from a practical perspective, I think it's only that if you're using OpenAI models, it's going to have more features than with other models. But in this sense, it is important to realize that Azure OpenAI service, to my best understanding, no longer has any unique features. You don't have to use Azure OpenAI service and its playground and its Azure OpenAI Studio, because everything is here in Azure AI Studio. Whether you like it more or not, that's a matter of preference, obviously. All right. So essentially what we have is multiple models under a single surface. We can host those 1,600 models in VMs, but as serverless, only 30. You can have these these models deployed at an AI project or at the hub level, depending on how you want to share them, and what's your way of arranging resources. These same control surfaces, in every sense, you have. I'm going to be talking about prompts, evaluations, and so on. All of this is going to be available regardless of where this model came from. And that enables you to do some scenarios like test your application on multiple models easily with some constraints. Let's talk about prompt engineering. And this is maybe the part where there is most value in the future. But there are also quite a lot of caveats, and I am not sure how to integrate this into my personal workflow, and you will soon see why is that.
Question.
Yeah.
On the pricing, did you mention the price of the PTU?
No, I did not mention the price of the PTU.
Is it the case that the €5 per hour is quite a lot cheaper than the PTU?
€5 an hour is cheap compared to some of the PTUs. I think the PTU pricing is currently, so you can only get it from a Microsoft salesperson.
Yep.
I hope that will change in the near future. There are no public pricing lists for PTUs. I'm sorry about that. If you're an enterprise customer, you will know. They have tried to sell it to you. All right. So prompt engineering. All of us do it at some level. How professionally we do it differs based on what we're actually trying to do here. But there are a lot of questions that Azure AI Studio can sort of help us resolve. First question, what is a good prompt? There is no universal definition. Usually, we think it's a good prompt when we get good results. The problem is that when you do 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 executions, you will get some part of the results that are good. Then there are going to be a few really bad apples. So the question is, how do you know it's a good prompt? How do you evaluate and classify prompts as good or bad? Then, more and more applications in the AI space are actually being constructed out of several prompts with logic between them. How do you test that? How do you manage it? How do you write such a code? How do you share that code to others? The simple answer is, well, I use C# and then I call the OpenAI SDK, and that works as well. If you want to go to a higher abstraction level, then this is something that AI Studio may be able to help you with. And then, referring to our last section, which models can I actually use on this prompt? Which models are able to reliably answer this question? And that's where we're going to head next. Let's start with the prompt catalog. And this is not as interesting as it sounds like, but it makes kind of sense. So Azure AI Studio has this thing called prompt catalog. It's like model catalog, but this is for prompts. If you go to the internet, you can find like 700 prompting guidelines in the first page of the Google alone. So you don't really need prompts. What you really need is an experience you can easily test different things on. So you can see there are kinds of different kind of scenarios: advertising summary, personalized marketing, parse unstructured data, whatever. My eye focuses on natural language to SQL. That is an interesting example. Let's look at this prompt. What happens here is that the system message is set up with a few PostgreSQL tables described in a certain syntax. And then there's a definition that we want accurate to list the names of the departments which employed more than 10 employees in the last 3 months. And then select. Now the question is, if we want to have a scenario like this, which models can actually complete this? Well, let me try it, because you can always do open in Playground. That is what Azure AI Studio is for. These things are simple to try here. So if I open it in Playground and I do GPT-4, no surprise, GPT-4 does it pretty nicely. It returns only the SQL statement completion you want, and this is actually a fairly good implementation. Depending on the SQL variant, that might actually even execute. You may want to instruct it if you want a specific dialect of SQL. Let's try it in Phi 3, a very small model. It also does a fairly good job. It uses a different dialect, so that would not execute on SQL Server maybe, but you still get a reasonable result. You also get a lot of text describing what you're actually doing, so that may be a plus or minus depending on what you're doing. And you can also try this on Llama, and you will get a response. But now, if you spend some time reading that, you would realize that the answer is wrong. It is a fairly subtly wrong one, because the other models actually completed the condition right. They do return departments with more than 10 employees in the last 3 months. Llama returns departments that had paid at least 30 salary payments, not different persons. So these are very subtle differences, but this kind of shows you how complicated it is to actually test models, because the differences can be so small and still so critical. But if you want to go down this route, then Azure AI Studio may well be your tool. And the next things that are going to help you with that is our prompt flow and tracing. And I'm going to talk about these together because it's different to tell them apart at some point. How many of you are actually using prompt flow? One. Cool. Prompt flow is an open source project built mostly by Microsoft, but contributed by others as well. It is a Python-based toolkit for creating executable flows that link LLMs, prompts, Python code, and other tools together. That sounds complicated. It also sounds a bit like LangChain or semantic kernel, but it's not. What prompt flow is, it's a toolkit for creating deterministic flows. Essentially, it is a beautified version of creating YAML files. Again, I think half of the world is that right now. So essentially, the whole toolkit creates flow.dag.yaml files that describe a flow. They are available as command line Python tools. There is a VS Code extension, so you can use a graphical designer to build those flows, and you can do it within Azure AI Studio. And I would say that unless you're really hardcore, you will want to use the Azure AI Studio one. When you realize the benefits, then you're going to go with the Visual Studio Code. What does a flow look like? Here's an example. Chat with Wikipedia. So this is a very simple RAG scenario, so retrieval augmented generation. We pick up some information, we send it to the model, and then the model will use it to answer the user's question. Here we have an input, which is a user's question. Then these are the steps built into the process in this particular flow. First one, extract query from question. For example, if I ask like, what's the capital of Finland? Then it's going to understand that the user is looking for something called capital of Finland. That is what a large language model does well. It understands the user's intent and picks up the key phrase. Then we have get wiki URL, which what it essentially means is it formats out a Wikipedia search URL that contains the search keyword found out by the LLM. Search result from URL, this one, picks up the Wikipedia pages related to this search, and then process search result composes a unified search result for that. Then we have this part called augmented chat, which is the typical RAG prompt. So it picks up the Wikipedia source information and the source links, and then asks the model to answer the user's question. What this kind of thing looks like is that typically you have a prompt here, extract query from question, and you have a rather complicated prompt because it contains some kind of guidance to the model. How are you going to pick up the search terms? So that first stage is a call to the LLM. It's not shown in this picture, but here connection, you can specify which model this is going to connect to. And here you can also see it's an opportunity to do a multi-model flow. You could, for example, have this first step run on a different model than the last step, if that made sense to you. The second step, get wiki URL. Well, that's going to be Python code, because as I said, prompt flow is a Python toolkit. So now you have a piece of Python code that actually constructs you those Wikipedia search URLs. And so on. I'm not going to show you all the stages because there's no sense. If you have built RAG applications, you roughly understand what's happening here. If you have not built RAG applications, it's just a flow that gathers the user information, gathers the background information, and then uses an LLM to construct the answer for the user. What it actually looks like in practice is when you execute it, it looks like a chat. And the thing about prompt flow within Azure AI Studio is that you can easily test these things. So there is a tool called Start Compute Session. What it essentially does, it spins up a VM. By default, that VM shuts down after 1 hour not using it. So it spins up a VM that can run your flow, and then it executes it. It opens up a chat window, a playground for you. You type in a question, what is the capital of Finland? And then it executes all these steps, as you can see here in the middle of the screen. And once they're all completed, you have a debugger-like experience looking at it, execute them. Once it's done, it's going to give you an answer. And that's going to be a fairly good one at this, because the question was a good one. It was easy to find from Wikipedia. If it had not been, or you wanted to debug something that went going on there, there's this thing called view trace, which is another good reason to use AI Studio and prompt flow, because finding out what happened when you're doing something by hand can always be something, can sometimes be quite complicated. What happens when you use view trace is that it opens up a tracing view where you can view the whole execution tree here on the left-hand side. You see which steps took how much time. And if you go into any of the steps, you can see the input and output results. So that kind of helps you understand which stage should I tune to get this better. So this is kind of the first part where you can actually say Azure AI Studio provided some value. This is fairly hard to do by hand. Is it easy to do using prompt flow? Depends on if you know how to write Python. So that's kind of one of the problems with this tool. But it's useful, and the samples available out there in the prompt catalog, they actually help you get started even if you don't know Python. So that helps. Another thing, I don't know how many of you have actually tried prompt variants in the sense that you have had one prompt and then you had looked for a better version of it. Anyone? Yeah, maybe one or two. Yeah, this is something that comes up if you're trying to tune an AI application to consistently return the right answers. It's very hard to know what's the best wording for prompt. And there is, I don't think there is any magic source available for this one. You have seen many guidelines on the internet, but realistically, I think it's mostly about trying things. LLMs can help you in the process because they can create the variants themselves. And that is something that has been integrated into the prompt flow. So take this another flow that is very simple. It does a summarization of users' meeting notes. So I have configured an input that only contains a single text block of meeting notes. Then I have this LLM prompt. You are a bot that generates a succinct summary of a meeting's notes. Use whichever language the user is using in the notes. Be brief up to a length of 200 characters. Focus on facts and end results and remove personal opinions. That is my prompt. Now, I don't know if this is the best way to word that request to the model. There is no way to know. I can only test it. And as I've already shown you, prompt flow is an easy way to test things. But if you want to test different variants, the easiest way to approach that is to use this button called Generate Variants. Then I'm going to tell it, give me 3 ones. Give me 3 new wordings of this prompt that do roughly the same thing. Then I'm going to choose which model is it going to use to generate these variants. I generally think GPT-4 is the best one for this, but you could probably go somewhere else as well. Okay, this one was my original. Then it starts generating. I'm only going to show you 2 ones, but it generates versions. If you spend even 10 seconds looking at those, you will realize that they are roughly the same in intent. It's only minor details, stylistic details, but the LLMs respond to those, and sometimes some of those variants perform better than others. If you test with a single set of data, you may not even notice the difference. If you test with 1,000 inputs or 10,000 inputs and run those tests like 5,000 times or 10,000 times, you will usually notice difference. And this is kind of the direction where we're heading in. If we are trying to build, for example, like a B2C chat, where we actually have to be very aware of each response going out because everyone can be a PR disaster, then we're going to need all this testing. Anyway, I have these competing prompts, variants. Then I'm going to enter some meeting notes about IglooConf planning. And I'm going to have this model condense this stuff together. This is the reason why Saki came to the presentation. Awesome. What a waste of his time. But I wanted to waste it, to be honest. Okay, so I can run this summarization.
Who didn't send an abstract to this piece?
Yes.
Until last week. I do agree.
All right. That's enough love for this presentation. So as you can now see, the summarization box has an echo, sort of. There are multiple summarizations going on because prompt flow is executing this flow in several different copies. Now I only had variants for one of those prompts. I could also have variants for several ones of them, and I would have to look at all the combinations. But this flow is so simple that I only need that one. Okay, well, then I'm going to get different summaries. And all of these are essentially the same. There are no big differences. Some of them adhere to the length requirement better than others, but these differences are, as I said, not too different because I only tested with one piece of data. But the value proposition here is that you can actually do this testing with one piece of data, 100 pieces of data, 1,000 pieces, and then you can evaluate the answers together. Okay. So this is valuable, but now the question is what is the role of prompt flow when we go into production, because this was sort of a dev time experience. You can do many things with it. You can use it just as an IDE, or you can deploy these flows. So if you do a deploy flow, what actually happens is that Azure ML, or Azure AI, or whatever you want to call it, it will deploy a virtual machine, once again, a virtual machine that will host your flow. It will give it an Azure ML endpoint, and then you can just use it to a REST API to call your flow and get the results back. And this is sort of valuable if you want to do it that way, because what prompt tooling actually does here is you can get a sort of an experience from idea, prompt, Python code, all the way to iterating it, finding the good prompt, then trying variations to find the best prompt, then doing tracing to actually understand what's taking so long and where it's going wrong, then doing the deployment, and then having monitoring. So if you do this deployment, you will also be able to monitor your production executions as well. The question is, do you want to use this? Because what it means is that you will have Python code and prompts separated out of your application code into this thing called Azure AI Studio. I don't know the answer. We still have way too little experience in LLM architectures to tell the final answer. I think this is one possible architecture. But it has its flaws. One of them is Python. Nothing wrong with Python. It's one fixed technology you need to stick to if you want to use prompt flow. Another thing is, do you even want deterministic flows? Because we are all the time moving towards Copilot-style solutions where users are not just asking for a piece of information in a chat. They are asking for action. They are asking for something like, create me a travel invoice for my last week's trip to Stockholm. And you expect the Copilot to be able to parse your intent and then trigger processes. And that is not a deterministic flow. It does not flow from up to down. No. It flows to a decision point where the model or the planner actually decides what's going to happen next. We are going to call this travel invoice plugin or whatever. The problem here is that prompt flow is not really engineered for this kind of activity. It is engineered for deterministic flows right now. The other question is, do you actually want this control inside your application? Because you can use something like semantic kernel, which is available for Python, Java, .NET. and run this kind of decision-making and flow control and planning sequences right inside your app and control it within your code. That's good in the sense that you will have all the control available locally. That's bad in the sense that if you want to update the LLM logic, you will have to update your application. So what this hosted prompt flow actually enables you to separate out your AI parts from your application code to this Azure service. It's a higher abstraction level service. You will have the AI, the intelligent parts of your app running on Azure, and you can always go and edit them just using prompt flow in production. Now that sucks. So essentially what this means, you will end up having some kind of LLM ops. So you will have GitHub or Azure DevOps with deployment pipelines pushing into prompt flow. All of this is possible, but it is very painful right now. So we're not there. But if you want to go this route, then you're going to have to think about not just using the beautiful IDE, but also managing the changes. Even if you want to discard everything like that, still, prompt flow is maybe the best tool available right now for testing prompt variations and so on. So I would recommend looking into it, but it's not a simple proposition to go into production with it. Cool. LLM apps. Now we have built the prompts. We have maybe built the flows. Now we have this question of evaluation. Did we evaluate already? Well, we tried. We tried with some data, we tried with some results. But then there are other aspects of what can we actually evaluate. And if we try with large amounts of data, we can't do that just using our eyes and hands in prompt flow. No, we're going to need the evaluation feature. And what we're going to need it for, because we want a systematic way to test LLM solutions, so for example flows, against a set of some kind of measurements. And the industry is working hard to find out these measurements. There are things like coherence, so how coherent is the answer? Is it readable to a user? How relevant it is? Is it just responding to the user's question? How well is it grounded in the facts that the model was given? How linguistically correct it is? Is it good language? Is it easy to read? And then there are different safety factors and so on. There are like, I think, 11 or 12 metrics available for this right now. What Azure AI Studio does for you, it allows you to pick up a flow or other LLM solution. It allows you to give it some test data, and then it unifies them into a pipeline where it spins up a container. The gray box is a container. It evaluates the model with the given data enough times to understand what kind of results it gets out, and then it uses an analysis engine to understand what kind of level of groundedness, for example, or safety, or violence control did actually happen during the process. So you can also test for these content safety features. And then out you get evaluation results. I'm going to be perfectly honest here and say that this is a bit flaky part. It works when it works. I am having trouble getting it to work with real-life scenarios. For example, last night I tried to create a new version of these slides, and I failed because I just did not get the results to work right now. It is a preview. Take that seriously. But it is good when it works. So just roughly speaking, what happens is you can select the flow, and you can say this is a question and answer without context. You upload some data. For example, in this scenario, I sent 2 questions. What is the capital of Finland, and which team does Lauri Markkanen play for? And I also provided the right answers. And essentially what would happen then is that there is going to be a delay of like maybe 3 to 7 minutes on a typical data set, is my experience. And then you would get a result back. I did not get a result back, so these images are just from the much of learn. But what you get is a graphic representation of, is everything right? So did we filter out sexual content? Did we filter out self-harm? How good were we in terms of relevance and groundedness in each of these questions? And this kind of provides you the 360 degrees understanding of how did your model perform under real-world data, under repeated executions. Something that you can't really do with prompt flow just using the execute button because it takes too much of your time. Very good, very good. A couple of more points before I finish up. Because there are 2 boxes I did not really cover. Customizing content filtering, has anybody ever done that? The only customer I ever hear about content filters is that can we turn them off? And that is particularly true because some of Azure's content safety features work in a bit strange way when used with Finnish content, so that's something that happens every now and then, but typically people are quite satisfied with how they work. What you can do here is that you can customize a content filter, but what customization means is that you can pick up different kinds of categories of offensive content like violence, hate, sexual content, self-harm, and then you can set the tolerance from 3 options, low, medium, and high. Well, that's not great. Then you can also have a block list. You can set a block list of different kinds of words you don't want to appear either in the inputs or the outputs of the model.
Is there a whitelist?
No, there is no whitelist.
For example, word chest.
Yeah, this is the problem. There is no whitelist. And Microsoft is pretty sticky when it comes to trying to change the content safety filter into a looser direction. There are scenarios where you want to be able to freely discuss self-harm, for example, let's say a medical help. You want doctors to be able to talk about overdoses of medication, for example. You can't use this user interface to do that. You have to talk to Microsoft and give them your idea and your business case scenario, and then they're going to look into it and maybe enable free use of content safety. I think that's fairly easy process these days if you actually have a good scenario, but it's still manual work. You can essentially do this to tighten up your content filter. You can have several different content filters, and I think Microsoft's vision here is that you can use this to have sort of a centralized control. So if you're seeing abuse attempts or you're seeing PR risks happen with a B2C chatbot, then you can just go here, not touch the code, but just change the content filter to be more strict. That makes sense. I have not seen real-world use for it. That's why I'm not going to spend any more time on that one. And fine-tuning models. Anyone done that? Yes, I don't think you have to. It's very unlikely that you're going to need it, but you may have to because there are going to be certain scenarios. Don't use it to feed your own data to the model. It's not going to work very well. If you need to have a small model doing a large model's work in a specific scenario, that might work. If you want to change the tone of voice of a model entirely, and you have the time to generate enough sample data for the fine-tuning, it may work. If you do need it, Azure AI Studio has the UX for doing that. So Azure AI Studio is a good tool for this, but I don't think this is the right solution for most of our AI projects right now. So that's kind of where we are. As for recap, we roughly covered all these 7 balloons. What's happening here is that AI Studio is Microsoft's sort of a centralized attempt to make all this happen in a single user interface. It makes sense. There is a lot going on. There is still ways to go before everything is over here. And one good example is that this thing called Copilot Studio, which used to be Power Virtual Agents, is a totally separate thing. It may even remain so, I don't know. But there are several nexuses for building AI solutions. Azure AI Studio is Azure's #1 spot. It's kind of starting to create an abstraction for these cloud AI building blocks, so a higher level of abstraction of building LLMs instead of just calling Azure OpenAI Service from your code. Whether this approach, prompt flow and the friends, is going to be the right one, I don't know. It may be, but the jury is out there. But we're still seeing so much innovation and evolution going on all the time. It's very hard to understand which are going to be the winner solutions for the future. And one thing to understand is if you are a classic .NET developer, you are not going to feel at home here all the time because these solutions are built by and for people with an ML background, with some Python competence typically. So you can get used to that kind of thinking here. It's not that you can't do things with .NET. Apart from prompt flow, you can do everything with .NET. But samples are predominantly in Python. Guidance is written for machine learning and data scientist people. So that's a new set of mind for over here. I don't know if that's going to change over time. Maybe it does. And this is now, as of build, it is GA. Many of the features I covered are under preview, and take that preview seriously because I personally think that it's going to take 1 or 2 years before this is mature. I'm Jouni Heikniemi from Davidson, and that's all I have for today. Thank you very much.